Few cities in the world can claim the same level of fame, of culture, and possessing the level of prestige in the art world as Paris. It became known as La Ville-Lumière, or the City of Lights, and it was one of the first true international cities, heavily influencing both European and world history for hundreds of years. Tyrants both ruled it and coveted it for themselves. During the early stages of the Great War, Kaiser Wilhelm II came frighteningly close to marching triumphantly through its streets. So much so that he would spend the next 4 years dreaming lecherously of standing atop the famous Eiffel Tower, looking down at the city below, now draped in the German flag. It would be a dream he would not realize, but one he would share with a young Austrian-born corporal serving in his army in the trenches of the Western Front. In this episode, we are going to look at how Adolf Hitler would, nearly 22 years later, achieve in just a few weeks what the Kaiser failed to do in 4 years, and turn out the City of Lights. Welcome to Wars of the World. This is the story of the fall of Paris. Hitler looks west. After nearly 6 years of appeasing the expansion of Adolf Hitler's Third Reich beyond the borders outlined to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles, the Führer's invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939 was the final straw for the Western European allies of Britain and France. When their demands for Hitler to withdraw from Poland were ignored, London and Paris had no choice but to declare war on Germany. However, in reality, this declaration did little to stop the charge of the German Wehrmacht eastward. The situation made all the more complicated by the subsequent invasion of eastern Poland by the Soviet Union, Hitler and Stalin having agreed to carve up the country earlier in the year. As such, as Britain and France continued mobilizing, they were effectively doing so on behalf of an already lost cause. Now the main aim for London and Paris was to contain Hitler from moving any further, particularly into France itself, the two opposing countries sharing a long land border with each other. Despite reports from Poland describing a lightning-quick campaign involving tanks and aircraft working in unison to smash through defensive lines, the prevailing opinion amongst French leaders, especially, was that when their army finally met the Germans in combat, it would rapidly deteriorate into the type of static warfare of the last war. Remembering the devastation the Great War had wrought upon France, French leaders were this time determined to keep the front line along the border. And to that end, the French constructed a network of defensive positions stretching from the North Sea and the Belgian border down along its border with Germany and ending at the Mediterranean. Dubbed the Maginot Line, French propaganda portrayed these fortifications as being continuous and impenetrable to any army coming from the east. However, both these claims were false. In fact, there were large patches where natural obstacles were expected to make the construction of defences unnecessary, while the expected invasion routes received the bulk of resources. But perhaps the most crucial failing of the line was that it largely neglected the Belgian border. French leaders assumed that Hitler would not be willing to violate Belgian neutrality, which might encourage other nations to join the war against them. This had been the spark, after all, that forced Britain into the Great War in 1914. In this instance, they were proven wrong. Hitler had wanted to attack France as soon as possible, hoping to take advantage of the fact that the French were still mobilizing. He feared that if France and Britain had time to fully gear up, they would strike east against him from behind the protective curtain of the Maginot Line. And he knew that on paper at least, the German army was still at a technical and numerical disadvantage compared to the combined power of London and Paris, both of whom were also calling on their empires to provide men and equipment. He couldn't have known that French leaders had no intention of launching a major offensive anytime soon, instead hoping Hitler's forces could be worn down trying to pass through the Maginot Line. In fact, Some French leaders believed it would be 3 years after the start of hostilities that Germany would be weakened enough by the line and aerial bombing that they would emerge from behind their fortifications. However, 3 factors tempered the Führer's impatience. First, the winter of 1939 and 1940 was particularly bad in the region, which would have only served to hinder his troops' progress. Secondly, an aircraft carrying the initial draft of his invasion plans crashed in Belgium in January 1940, forcing him to rethink his plan of attack, believing the Belgians would have no doubt recovered the plans and shared them with his enemies. Finally, there was the impact of the Maginot Line itself. Everyone in Hitler's inner circle knew that despite the flaws in its conception, the Maginot Line would be a tough nut to crack. And even if the Wehrmacht broke through, it would cost Germany dearly. Hitler therefore turned to General Erich von Manstein and asked him for his opinion on how they should proceed. Von Manstein proposed a bold but risky plan that involved the invasion of the neutral Low Countries of Belgium and Holland, and then strike south into France, effectively outflanking the Maginot Line and allowing German troops to pour into France. Manstein's plan envisaged these panzer divisions operating in a semi-independent role, striking ahead of the main body of the army supported by the Luftwaffe to disrupt and disorientate the Allies. This was a much more ambitious strategy than even the one used in Poland, and was met with opposition by the more conservative-minded generals. Even Hitler had his misgivings, but being the gambler that he was known to be, he decided to risk it all on von Manstein's plan, thinking that if his men could pull it off, he could win the war in weeks. Paris goes to war. War had only narrowly been averted in 1938, during the Czech crisis of 1938, when Hitler annexed the Sudetenland in western Czechoslovakia. While again Hitler was appeased, rather than confronted, across Europe, there was a feeling that he was not yet done with his expansion of German territory. War, it seemed, was inevitable. To that end, as a precautionary measure, authorities in Paris began the construction of trenches to defend the city and bomb shelters to protect its citizens from air raids. While some welcomed these precautionary measures, others simply accused the authorities of making an unnecessary mess, since even if war did break out, most Parisians were confident that the fighting would always be contained east of their impenetrable Maginot Line. As murmurs of an impending war began to trickle out of Germany and Poland, the result of a German-manufactured incident along their borders, intended to be a pretext for invasion. On August 31st, 1939, the first of 30,000 Parisian children were evacuated to the countryside. The next day, Hitler invaded Poland. Answering the call of their country, Parisian men flocked to the army, but those who remembered the jubilant scenes of 1914, as young men drunk on propaganda, believing they were off on an exciting adventure, couldn't help but notice the different tone this second time around. Over the previous 20 years, the next generation had grown up knowing full well the horrors of war and what they could be facing, having been told the truth from their fathers. But this was something they had to do. Therefore, instead of men cheerily chanting "On to Berlin," they were instead grumbling, "Let's get it over with." Meanwhile, as well as the children being evacuated, authorities also began evacuating some of the national treasures that made up the cultural landscape of the French metropolis. Paintings, statues, and even the stained glass windows of the 13th century Sainte-Chapelle chapel were removed to protect them from being blown out by bombs landing nearby. However, everyone knew the one national treasure they wanted to protect the most was the one they couldn't move: the Eiffel Tower. For those who remained, life in the city was disrupted by the war preparations. But following the shock of the declaration, and the fear that any second German bombers would be blacking out the sky, unleashing their deadly payloads of bombs, when nothing seemed to be happening, the residents began to relax. This is the period known as the phony war, where except for skirmishes at sea and in the air, there seemed to be almost no war at all. Thus, while ration cards for food were issued and blackouts were ordered at night, Paris's thriving food and entertainment sectors continued to enjoy regular visitors, patrons confident that their Maginot Line was keeping Germany in its place. That confidence was shattered on May 10, 1940. Despite promises from their leaders that Hitler would honour Belgian neutrality, now his army was blasting its way through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the Maginot Line almost completely. The only thing that shocked Parisians more was the speed at which the Wehrmacht was pouring into their country. News of the unfolding tragedy being relayed to them by growing numbers of refugees fleeing the march of the Germans, clogging up roads and railway stations, and overwhelming authorities. Within 5 days, German troops were barely 155 kilometers or 96 miles away as they advanced on the outskirts of Loon. British and French forces on the Maginot Line attempted to redeploy to meet their invaders in Belgium, but von Manstein's panzers wreaked havoc behind their lines. And with the Luftwaffe quickly achieving air superiority everywhere amongst the Allied forces, an unwavering sense of defeatism took hold, particularly as by May 20th, German troops had reached the English Channel. The Allies planned a counter-offensive, but the sea of refugees fleeing the fighting choked their progress. By May 24th, the commander of the British Expeditionary Forces, General Lord Gort, felt enough was enough and ordered his troops to the coast near the town of Dunkirk, where hopefully they could be evacuated home. It was in the final 24 hours of said evacuation when the moment every Parisian had feared finally came. On June 3, 1940, the sound of air raid sirens followed by the drone of aero engines sent the residents of Paris and the thousands of refugees running for shelter. The primary target for the air raid was the city's Citroën factory, although the devastation inevitably spread into the neighbouring suburbs. 254 people were killed, of which 195 were innocent civilians, unrelated to the target or the city's defence. The world was outraged. The French population were horrified. Everyone knew that France was doomed by this point, which left the question as to why the Germans chose to undertake such a raid. Regardless, now Parisians were joining the stream of refugees, attempting to push further west in the vain hope of some kind of safety, either in French-controlled territory or even to Britain or neutral Spain in the south. Trains were leaving Paris stations with no set destination, while roads out of the city became gridlocked with cars, carts, and a sea of people carrying what few belongings they could. With the news that following the raid on the Citroën plant had sent the French government itself fleeing, everyone knew Paris would soon be on the front lines. Meanwhile, in response, on June 7, 1940, a single Farman NC-2234 bomber dubbed Jules Verne and flown by a French Navy crew set out and bombed the Siemens factory in Berlin. So confident were the Nazi leadership that such a raid couldn't happen that no blackout was ordered in the German capital, allowing the French crew to easily find their target. The symbolic raid was little more than a bee sting on the city, but it was also the match that would ignite a fire that within 5 years would have fully engulfed the seat of Nazi power. Opening the gates of Paris. As the British completed their evacuation, France was left to carry on a fight that even the proud French leadership had to accept was already lost. There was just a matter now of how to end it, either with some kind of negotiated peace or to fight to the very last, in what would ultimately be simply a gesture of resistance. On June 9th, German forces launched an offensive, the objective of which was the capital itself. By this time, the French government had relocated to Tours in central France for its protection, but was already looking to relocate again to Bordeaux. Realising the German objective, the French government weighed up their few remaining options. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill recommended they turn Paris into a fortress and make the Germans fight for every inch of the city. Reeling from what they saw as a British betrayal and even cowardice at the evacuation of their troops from Dunkirk, Churchill's suggestion was ignored by French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and his staff, who could not fathom seeing their beautiful historic city turn to ruin. They therefore made the most difficult decision of their war so far. Paris was declared an open city. No resistance would be offered to German forces when they arrived. In effect, with the sound of artillery and gunfire now being heard from the outskirts of the city, Paris had surrendered, and France would soon follow. It was on the morning of June 14th that German troops finally entered the city's limits. They drove into what looked like a ghost town. Those who could not escape or chose not to leave their homes stayed indoors for fear of being mistaken for French troops and shot at. Paris's cafes were shut, the theatres silent, the bars closed. Even markets were empty, as frightened and heartbroken Parisians hid in their homes, fearing that German jackboots were about to kick open their doors. The first Germans into the city belonged to the Wehrmacht's 18th Army under General George von Kuchler, and he was quickly followed by other generals eager to view their prize, a prize that many of them had only dreamed of seeing under German control, when they were young officers in the Kaiser's army 22 years earlier. German General Frederick von Bock wasted no time taking in the sights, visiting the tomb of Napoleon Bonaparte at the Hotel des Invalides, and draping a swastika over the Arc de Triomphe, before enjoying a luxurious meal at the Ritz Hotel. One of the more spectacular German arrivals that day was made by General Walter Wallemont, Deputy Chief of Operations Staff of the Armed Forces High Command. Wallemont had a 30-metre strip cleared of cars and obstacles at the Place de la Concorde City Square to allow his Pfizer Storch Fi-156 light aircraft to land. Another general to explore the city was Erwin Rommel, who had yet to be elevated to the near-legendary status he would later achieve fighting in the deserts of North Africa. Initially caught up in the excitement of the conquest, Rommel would later come to loathe the city for its many vices. Marching upon the city's most celebrated landmark, the Eiffel Tower, the general's hopes of viewing the city from the top were dashed when they discovered that before their arrival, the cables for the elevator to the top had been severed. Therefore, instead, a group of rather brave German soldiers were given the somewhat dubious honour of having to scale the tower in order to plant a swastika flag at the top. They succeeded, only to later watch it blow back down in a strong wind, foreshadowing that the German occupation of the city would only be temporary. As his generals explored their prize, Hitler was ecstatic at the news of the city's capture and ordered that German citizens hang out flags in celebration and that churches should sound their bells. He also directed his troops to immediately strike at the new French defensive line being formed in the south and west of the city. He wasn't taking any chances and was determined not to lose Paris now it was his. One of those who rushed to congratulate the Führer was Vyacheslav Molotov, Soviet Minister of Foreign Affairs, and one of the architects of the plan to divide Poland between Moscow and Berlin. However, the speed at which Paris fell sent alarm bells ringing with the Red Army leadership, many of whom suspected that Hitler would soon be turning his attention to them. 2 days later, Prime Minister Reynaud resigned, and an armistice was declared. Just under a week after that, France capitulated. Hitler goes sightseeing. Now under occupation, Paris authorities were forced to work with the German forces. Almost immediately, the city was searched for Jews who were made to wear a yellow Star of David to publicly identify them, and Jewish businesses were seized. Restrictions on the press were imposed, while German signs were soon erected for the drivers of German army vehicles, who often violated the city's speed limits until their commanding officers issued standing orders that they were to obey Paris's traffic laws. On June 21st, 24 hours before the signing of the armistice, Hitler had ordered that Paris be preserved as the world knew it, hoping to foster amenity with London, who Hitler hoped would now sue for peace, as well as in the United States, whom he feared might break their neutrality and join the war against him if he destroyed such a beloved international metropolis. Nevertheless, the Germans were soon draping Paris's buildings in swastikas and holding parades through its streets to remind its citizens that the city was now part of the Third Reich. Exactly when the Führer made his one and only visit to Paris has actually been debated by historians since the end of World War II. Many sources claim that the date was June 23rd, the day after the armistice was signed. Others argue it was either the 24th or possibly the 29th. Regardless, the Führer recalled later that touring the French capital was the greatest and finest moment of his life, as weeping French citizens were forced to line the streets and give a Nazi salute as he drove past. Despite his previous directive, he ordered the destruction of 2 Great War monuments in the city, one to General Charles Mangin, a French war hero, and one to Edith Cavell, a British nurse who was executed by a German firing squad for aiding in the escape of Allied prisoners of war from German-occupied Brussels, as well as preventing them from acting as reminders to the population of a time before their country's defeat. The destructive orders also highlights the Nazi regime's penchant for revising history as it suited them. Despite now controlling what he thought was one of the most beautiful cities in the world, he knew that he could not leave Paris outshining Berlin, and before he had even finished his tour, he was already contemplating undertaking a grand construction program for Germany's capital. He would later confess to his friend and architect, Albert Speer, that he was going to destroy Paris, not with bombs, but with superior architecture. In his future, Hitler could only see glory. He had achieved what many had thought was impossible, and captured the City of Lights itself. What could possibly stand in his way? Certainly not the island he spied through a set of binoculars from Calais, surely. Britain's army was finished. All he had to do now was cross the English Channel, and even if Prime Minister Churchill kept his promise to fight him for every scrap of British land, it would be a fight that, like with France and Poland before, it would ultimately be doomed. Perhaps already dreaming of next touring the Tower of London or Buckingham Palace, Hitler ordered his forces to prepare for the next phase of the war, the Battle of Britain.